So this quote really summarizes that by Daniel Keyes Moran. You can have data without information, but you cannot have information without data. So making sense of that data that we have is what's important tonight, or is what's important, and really giving data the meaning is, I think, the gap that we can fill by being data translators. So here's how I'm going to break it down. I'm going to talk about the what, the why, and the how of a data translator. So the what and the why can vary from organization to organization, but I think the how is what's most important, and it remains constant and the same. So that's where I'm going to be taking a deep dive and focusing on is the how and the common themes of the how, which are 3 pillars. Speak the language, know your audience, tell a story. So that's where we're going to be spending a majority of the time tonight. So the what? A data translator, I made this fancy word cloud to help you understand what a data translator is. They're a storyteller, a proactive leader, an industry expert. They're analytical, a thinker, business guru, connector, interpreter, communicator. They're a problem solver, and most importantly, they are a liaison. The slide is not changing. There we go. So a liaison, and that's because they sit in between the business and then on one side, and then data and IT on the other. So that's that data translator sweet spot. And because they sit in between these 2 departments or business units, they have to both understand the business knowledge and acumen on one side, and then the analytical and technical skill on the other. So they're really taking those 2 possibly siloed units within an organization and bringing them together. So my experience, most of my experience in consulting has been in the data visualization space. And what I love about data visualization is you are a data translator. So I sit right there in between. I'm talking to the data team, figuring out data requirements, figuring out the structure of the data, sometimes building the data model, and then talking to the business to understand what they need in their dashboard, understanding how the business functions so that I can recommend what data we should be pulling in or what the dashboard should look like. And with that analytical knowledge and knowledge of the tools, I can create impactful, effective, and efficient dashboards. So the why of a data translator. We talked about how there's plenty of data and data is only growing. But what's also growing is the ability to access advanced analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence, predictive modeling, data science. It's becoming out of the box in tools and technologies. It's becoming more readily available. And so as those things increase, a need for an effective data translator also increases. So these tools, technologies, and methods lead to an increased need for your business. So according to a McKenzie study, only 18% of companies believe that they can gather and use data insights effectively. So that right there is another part of the why. Why do you need somebody to sit in between the data and the business and to translate and to help a company use their data effectively and efficiently? So now we're going to jump into the how to be a data translator based on my experience. And like I mentioned, a lot of my experience has been in the data visualization space. So this how definitely has a data visualization lens. So the 3 pillars that I brought up at the beginning of the presentation are here again. First, speak the language. If you're sitting in between data and business, it's very important to understand both the data lingo and the business lingo. You need to know how to ask what you need from the data team, but also create the structure of the data model so that you can meet the requirements of the business. And in order to meet the requirements of the business, you have to be able to understand their lingo, their acronyms, and understand what their business needs are. You have to know your audience. So it's important to create content with your audience top of mind. Know what's important to them, and more importantly, how do they consume that information? And finally, the third pillar of telling a story. It's really important to have a story when you're communicating data because statistics alone don't stick as well as a story does. So data needs to have a purpose and a story that resonates with the consumer of that data. So that first pillar, let's dive into it a little bit more. Speaking the language. Here's that Venn diagram again, and I've included on the left side, business, on the right side, data. So we've got terminology, acronyms, organizational goals, industry terms, market trends, and current events. So all these things are extremely important to be able to understand the business, speak that business language, be able to know what they want and what will resonate with the users of the data. On the other side, it's the data structure, dimensions and facts of the data, data modeling, platforms and technology, on-prem versus cloud, predictive analytics, the ETL process, the list goes on. So if you don't understand that and know what to ask for, then you won't be able to meet those business requirements that you're getting from the users or consumers of the data. It's also important to understand the type of person that you might be interacting with and how they communicate. So when you're speaking with somebody in the data organization, they tend to be thorough, precise, process-oriented, detailed, which are all fantastic qualities of somebody who's working with data. So keep that in mind on how you're communicating, how you're requesting, and talking to that team. And on the flip side, I think there's a lot of different personalities on the business side, and it's important as the data translator to meet their communication style. So I would say observe how they like to communicate, connect, and make sure that you build trust because ultimately you want trust on both sides of that Venn diagram. And I have an example just from my current project of a question that came up, and it was from our data team asked me. They said, there's a settlement purchase sales computed field that's S, while the purchase sales field is P, and the inbound outbound code is O, which is implying erroneous data in the purchase sales column. Do you agree? So if I was to just pass that along to the business and ask them that same question, it would not work. So that's a great example of how can I translate that to a question where I can get the answer and then give it back to the data team in a way that makes sense to them. So that's the importance in this scenario of a data translator, and some of the work that needs to be done there is a lot of data profiling to understand how the back end maps to the front end. Oftentimes that is not documentation that is readily available, but is very important. So some practical tips that I came up with on speaking the language is to constantly be learning. Be a student of the data team, be a student of the business. Number 2, take smarter notes. This one's huge. If you're just taking aimless notes that you think you may go back to, what I find is I don't. So as I'm speaking or as I'm taking notes, I'm using quotation marks. If I hear somebody from the business say something that I don't know what it means, but maybe it's a common term. For example, in my current project, they said 50% of your base is spot. That was one of the notes that I found in quotation marks of making sure I understand what that means. Or they talked about specialty contracts. right off the bat, I didn't know which contracts were specialty contracts. So that's an example of where quotation marks are extremely helpful. Note who's speaking. That's something that I found really beneficial when going back to my notes. And then section as you go. So I always have, as I'm taking notes in a meeting or when I'm talking to someone, open questions. And instead of having my open questions throughout my whole OneNote page, I'll quickly take my cursor up, type my open question. If there's an action item, I have a different section for action items. And then I'll try to, in my actual body of notes, break it down with headers based on the conversation and topic that we're discussing, which just makes it much easier to go back and make those notes more useful. And ask questions, I put once, which isn't always practical, but I think it's important to, while you're constantly learning and taking smarter notes, do your best to only ask those questions once as you're learning and being a student of the business and a student of the data. So next is know your audience. This is that second pillar of how to be a data translator. The three types of audiences that I came up with are peers, managers, executives. So when you think about when you're providing a report or an analysis or a summary, your very first question should be, who is the audience? Who's going to be consuming this data? It's a question I ask often, whether somebody asks me for a dashboard or whether it's, most recently, somebody asked me for a bullet to summarize. I'm working with Einstein Analytics, which is Salesforce's data visualization tool. And they asked me for a bullet of the benefit of Einstein Analytics. And my first question back was, who's the bullet for? Where's it going? Give me some context. So with peers, your analyses and reports are usually very analytical, discrete, with a lot of supporting detail. For the managers, it tends to include recommendations, more operational focused, summarized view of the data. Finally, your executives, think high level KPIs, organizational trends. So it's important to not create one report for all. It's cater your analysis to the audience. And I have an example to share that was on a project at Slalom. We were analyzing the success and adoption of a new tool that we were implementing. And somebody on my team, a coworker, came to me and said, here's some data I've gathered, and I've put together these 3 slides. So I've intentionally made these graphs small because the data isn't relevant for this story. But this was the initial mock-up of, here is how I can summarize the data that I've collected on the success of the tool. So she asked me to take a look, and I learned that this is a presentation for the executive team. So my first step was making sure I understood the data, understood the detail, what was she actually measuring and recording, so that when I rolled up the metrics, they were correct. So this was the before, and with the executive team in mind, this was the after. So I took those 3 graphs and I summarized what each graph was telling them. So this is a perfect example of those KPIs, key performance indicators. They're high level, they're gonna stick, they're good, they're bad, and then with a brief description below. So 96% adoption, an increase in leadership support by 9%, and an increase in overall satisfaction by 33%. So the final pillar that I'm going to spend the most time talking about out of the 3, how to be a data translator, is telling a story. So Arianna Huffington, who is the co-founder of the Huffington Post, her quote is, "People think in stories, not statistics." So there was a report that I cited in my sources that they did a study where 5% remember statistics, 63% remember a story. So it's very true. Your data, even though your rolled up metrics are technically statistics, you have to combine the data together to tell a story. In my experience in the data visualization space has been mostly telling that story with that data viz lens. So taking the data and creating a dashboard that tells a story. So when I think about a high level process on how to tell a story with data, you always need to start with a business need or problem. A business need or problem will create an impactful dashboard or an impactful report that will help your business be more efficient and effective. So starting with the business need or problem, using data will result in insights that connect with the user and impact your organization for good. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the science of storytelling. We'll dive into these different types of memory and then how to use that to your advantage when creating data visualization to tell a story. So your eye takes in information, it passes some of the information to iconic memory, which then passes some more to short-term memory, and finally a small portion gets passed to long-term memory. So let's break those components down. Your eye, 70% of sensory receptors are in your eyes, which is a lot and definitely makes a dashboard have more impact and more meaning behind it. And I think because you're taking in so much through your eyes, that's why you have the iconic memory. So it's an unconscious processing of all this information that's coming in. And research shows that your brain actually discards 99% of that information. So it lasts more than a second, don't even realize it's happening. And then it passes that 1% into short-term memory. So your short-term memory can only hold 5 to 9 pieces. A research study, for example, they tested people they had them listen to a series of 20 names, and on average, they could only hold about 7 names at the end of that 20. So short-term, you have a limited number of information you can retain, and your brain is looking for significance and relevance. It lasts only a few seconds, and then it passes some of that information into long-term long-term memory. There's unlimited capacity in your long-term memory. Once it gets passed, information gets passed to long-term memory, it gets filed into your brain because your brain interprets it as important. And your long-term memory can last for hours, days, months, and even years. So now let's focus in and what's important for a data translator in order to tell a good story is to understand how can we better help information to pass through each stage. So to pass from your eye into your iconic memory, it's really important to remove clutter and distraction. So with a dashboard, you want to make sure that there's no extra components on the dashboard. Remove any extra borders and lines. I will pull up a dashboard in a few slides and we can dive a little bit deeper into what that looks like. Reduce precision of your KPIs and your numbers on your dashboard. So everything should have a purpose on the dashboard. That's how you reduce clutter. And it's also important to highlight important call outs so that you can minimize any distraction and help the brain know what to pass into the iconic memory. So then into short-term memory, tips to think about is limiting the number of categories that you're seeing at first glance with the option to filter and drill in further into your report or your dashboard, into that story that you're telling with data. And Gestalt's principles are the other big one when it comes to recognizing patterns in the data. So this is a fancy image I found that represents Gestalt's principles really well. I included a link in the sources if you want to read in detail. I'm going to highlight just a couple and not go through all of it in detail, but essentially it's principles to understand how the human eye perceives visual elements. For example, continuation. When you connect dots through a line, maybe in a line graph, you can show trends and the brain perceives those elements to be more related than if you had not connected them. Similarity is things that are similar shape and size. Your brain's going to automatically relate those two things together. Figure and ground is understanding that on a visual, even though it's a 2D page, you have layers, and through different components of a dashboard, you can create figure and ground and group things together using that principle and to better tell a story. And then closure. So closure is saying that if you enclose something in a box, your brain's going to think everything in that box goes together, or everything to the left of the line is associated together. So some of these principles may seem intuitive, but having them written out and then keeping them in mind as you're designing a dashboard and telling a story is really important. And I found all of these principles to be helpful at some point during designing a dashboard. So finally, passing from short-term memory into long-term memory. Some tips there would be to connect the data together. So with a dashboard, have those different components relate to each other, tell the story, solve a business problem or need, and then have a clear call to action. So with the goal of telling a good story in order to store data in that long-term memory, keeping all those different tips in mind will help you create a dashboard that has impact and tells a good story. And I pulled in a dashboard that I made in order to talk through dashboard design, reporting, and talk through some of those principles and use an example in action. So how to spark long-term memory. So this was a dashboard I made with March Madness data 2 years ago. As you can see, there's the overall report general dashboard design theory is to start with high-level KPIs at the top and then have supporting graphs and detailed tables below that. If you think about how you read a book from left to right, the most important part of your dashboard is going to be the top left corner. That's where the eye is most naturally going to go. And so make sure you prioritize that space. Real estate is precious on dashboards, and anything you can do to more effectively use a dashboard real estate is going to be better. We have the logo and the title up top. Interestingly enough, some research says that or argues that the title and the logo of your company should go at the bottom of every report. Logically, it makes sense. You know what company you work for, or at least you should, and you probably know what dashboard you're looking at because you've navigated to it. However, I generally have the titles at the top, which leaves room for the company logo. At the same time, I do make it very small, as you can tell, as to not waste any space. And the reason space is so valuable is because you want to minimize scrolling. Scrolling takes away from a dashboard experience. If at all possible, you do not want a scroll bar on your dashboard. Definitely no horizontal scrolls. And if you have to scroll through a dashboard, or excuse me, a graph, it should be a vertical scroll. So here's an example of total wins per team. And there are more teams than fits in this graph. And so that's why I've created a horizontal bar chart. If I created a vertical bar chart, then there would be a horizontal scroll, and we want to avoid that. So keeping scrolls in mind as you design a dashboard is important. So then we have the KPIs. We talked about reducing precision of numbers, and you can see that that's done here. For example, the total points, instead of reading out the full number, which likely won't stick, it's rounded to 305,000 points. I put the title at the bottom of the KPI or key performance indicator, and that's because it's a distraction. It can be a distraction when it's on top. Once you've seen the dashboard a couple times, you're generally not reading the titles. So they're below it for reference, but they're small, they're a lighter color. I'm trying to minimize the distraction of the title, of the different KPIs, and also the graphs. The different graphs here are all supporting the KPIs in different ways. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, but I want to call out this tree map is what it's called right here. So a pie graph, although very popular, is actually a poor use of real estate because you're taking up, there's a lot of, I guess, wasted white space around a pie chart. So a tree map is a good alternative, and research says that your brain can actually better determine and break down the different categories when you're using boxes versus slices of a pie. So this is a tree map and showing a distribution or parts of a whole. If we were consuming this in the actual tool, you would see that it's interactive. You can click and gain more insights by having the graphs filter each other and relate, which is extremely important. And as you're reading left to right, have the graphs kind of make sense in what information the user or consumer would be looking for and wanting to understand when they're using their dashboard. Over here on the right-hand side is an example of the figure and ground, which is one of those Gestalt principles. I've used a light gray background in the ground of the dashboard to indicate that all of those things are similar. So they are all slicers or filters that you can use to slice and dice the data and figure out what you need to know. You can use specific call outs, which I don't show here, but those are ways to better tell a story. And then detail at the bottom. It's important to keep, detail can be a distraction. Generally, it's important to be on a dashboard, but bottom right-hand corner, bottom of the dashboard, even like a show hide button are all good options when showing detail tables. So I've summarized those tips here. Simple but descriptive title and labels. Use tooltips or additional tabs to provide further explanation and context. Use color only when necessary to emphasize or differentiate. Use the axis or data labels on a graph. This one's big. You don't need both. So if you think about this graph right here, total wins per team, if I had grid lines behind it, as well as showing up here, maybe on the x-axis, where 5 points was and 10 points or 10 wins were, it could be distracting, and it's redundant because I have the labels here as well. 18 wins for Wisconsin. So pick one. That's a really easy, simple fix that can minimize clutter, clean up your dashboard, and already make a more impactful dashboard and story. Avoid the temptation to use fancy or more complex visual types just to make your report look more impressive. Top left is most important real estate. Minimize unnecessary objects. Only everything on the dashboard should have a purpose. Keep your formatting consistent for a better user experience, and avoid scrolling. So what next? I thought through 2 final slides, both highlighting if you're looking to hire a data translator, and then if you're looking to be a data translator. So first, hiring. There's 4 essential skills, and this content comes from a Harvard Business Review article on how to hire a good data translator. The link is in the sources. number one, domain knowledge. So translators need to be experts in their industry and their company to identify value in AI and analytics, but also take that value and translate it to the business and give it context. They have to have technical fluency to be able to sit in between the data and tech and the business. So strong acumen in quantitative analytics and structured problem solving. They have to have great project management skills because there's oftentimes a need for a data translator to lead an initiative from the initial stages all the way through to completion. And finally, an entrepreneurial spirit. I think this is beneficial to some of that, always being a student, constantly learning. They need to be enthusiastic and committed and business savvy to navigate those roadblocks that come up when you're sitting in between two possibly siloed units, and any sort of technical or organizational roadblocks can emerge. And finally, a recap of the how on being a data translator. So speaking the language, knowing your audience, and telling a story, those three pillars lead to being an effective and efficient data translator and can result in using data to impact your organization for better. And we have some time for Q&A.
Yeah, I was just gonna jump in here, Erinn. Yeah, so for Q&A, we have a few questions in here already. But if anyone wants to ask any questions, feel free to just use that Q&A tool on here too. It just makes it a little bit easier. And then we'll start working through a few of these. So I guess there's just a handful of these in here right now, so we can kind of start at the top here. It says, could putting the company logo at the bottom of the dashboard to help associate the storytelling of data with your company, given the right people are reading it left or right?
Yes, I think the question is saying bottom versus top. Either way, I think the logo should definitely be on a dashboard to stay consistent with branding and kind of that showing what the dashboard is for. So the logo should definitely be on there, and I think you could make an argument on both ways on whether it should be top left, top right, or maybe bottom of the dashboard. And if I didn't answer that question, feel free to ask it again.
Awesome. So then there's another one on here that just asks simply, what was the visualization tool you used for the dashboard for the NCAA thing? Okay,
that one was Power BI. So that's Microsoft's data visualization tool.
Perfect. And let's see here. We got one too. Just wondering, kind of, I think just to get a better feeling, they wanted to know what is the difference between an IT consultant, a business analyst, and a data translator?
Good question. So I would say those three jobs have a lot of overlap. I think data translator is, I see that more as an umbrella and can, a lot of different jobs, you can play the role of a data translator. My job being an example of that, that's not my title, data translator. I am a data and analytics consultant, but a lot of what I do is translating the data. So I think the business analyst has less of the technical skill, sits more on the business side, would probably have to understand components of the data, but isn't really deep in it at all. I would say the IT consultant is likely more in the depths of the IT, the data side. Both play a role in data translation, but somebody who really sits and does work on both sides. So you're meeting with the business and you're meeting with the data team. I think that's the true data translators. However, I think it's important in all three of those jobs.
Cool. Yeah, so next we got one here from Tyler. Says if your business is looking to use data for insights but doesn't use these formal dashboard tools, is there any best practices to apply these principles?
Good question. I would say first step is confirming that your organization doesn't use any sort of tool. I've been on projects before where we've been surprised by other tools that they are using or that they do have enterprise-wide licensing for. So doing your research to figure out where those tools exist already is probably step one. But step two, if they don't exist, I think there's a lot of ways you can still use tools to create impactful visuals, to create stories with your data. For example, I created this entire presentation in PowerPoint, and I used Power BI to create some of the visuals and then copy and paste them in. But I used all those principles throughout this presentation. And there are some tools like Power BI that you can download for free. If you need to share it with anyone, that's where licensing starts to come in and you need to pay. But as far as having the tool on your desktop and being able to use it to quickly import an Excel file or some data that you have and create some visuals, that's a great option. It's a little more straightforward and a good stepping stone in the right direction. And then I would encourage you to have your organization get behind a tool and do something enterprise-wide, consistency and governance around data and analytics, I guess, platform.
Cool. We're going to skip around a little bit through some of these. We're getting a few more in here. Let's see here. All right, we have one from Clarissa. It just says, what is the value of an analytics translator during the beginning of a project sales cycle, meaning while pitching a project and putting together a proposal?
I think the most benefit of a data translator comes from the actual project, doing the work, implementing whatever it is that you're building and on that data and analytics platform for the consumers of the data. For this very initial proposal and sales cycle, I think having that data translator lens and glasses on when you're creating content is important because these concepts can be applied anytime you're communicating. So if you're creating a proposal and thinking through speaking the language, it's important to make sure that in that proposal, you're demonstrating that you understand their business, that you can help them solve their business problems because you understand them. Then you want to know your audience that you are presenting to, and that's going to impact the proposal, the presentation that you're creating, and the level of depth that you're including in that proposal. And then telling the story of, you're oftentimes telling your company's story if you're a consultant of what we can do for a client. So that story is important to tell, and then also making sure you capture the current state of the client and the story of what could be with that proposal. So I think all those concepts apply. Having somebody who is a data translator and can really speak the data language and is in the weeds on both sides, I don't think is as important in that cycle of creating a proposal for a project.
Perfect. And then I think this kind of encompasses a couple of these questions, but essentially people seem to wonder what tools that you use. I mean, I know you talked about a few tools already, but what are the other tools that you use? And then also kind of how do you decide, and there's a few of these questions that kind of fit into here again, that how do you decide which type of visualization you use? So yeah.
Good questions. So the tools that I've used, the majority of my projects have been in the Microsoft stack. So I've used Power BI on several projects, Azure Analysis Services for data modeling, used SSRS for some reporting. And then my current project is a Salesforce project where I'm using Einstein Analytics to create visuals, dashboards that are embedded within a Salesforce tool. And I've had experience with Tableau briefly. I haven't used Tableau as much, but that's another big one, big competitor to Microsoft. If you're interested in learning more about BI tools, business intelligence tools, the Gartner quadrant is every year they do an analysis of the existing tools in different spaces. So BI, data viz space, you'll see on a quadrant of 2 different axes, they rank all the different tools. So Tableau, Microsoft, Click, Power BI, Einstein Analytics, and it kind of shows the distribution of how competitive all those tools are and where they excel. And they also, I believe they do it for data warehousing platforms and other areas as well. So that was the first part of the question. Second part is how to decide what graph to use. That one is a bit of learn as you go. I think there are right and wrong graphs to use. So if you want to understand the percentage of a whole, that's going to be a tree map, maybe a pie chart, or a bar graph where you are showing the bar broken up into different components. If you are tracking over time, you always want to use, if you're using time, use an x-axis because your eye goes from left to right, and then if you're using an x-axis, the time will go in order on the axes. So you can use a bar graph if you have gaps in data. Actually, it's really important if you have gaps, say you're showing monthly sales and there are months where you don't have sales. A line graph can actually be quite deceiving if you connect all the dots. So, but that's where you really want to use bar graphs. Line graphs are good if you have a lot of data points and you really want to focus on the trends. Those card visuals or KPIs, always important. Try to use those at the top to call out specific pieces of valuable information from your data. So I would say one of my tips was don't try to use overly complex graphs. And I really have found that to be beneficial. There was a project where we were using box plots and scatter plots and some statistical distributions. And we found that it was overall user experience was low, and overall usage was a little bit lower than we would have wanted. And I think it could have been because of the complexity, and we didn't necessarily need that complex. We didn't know our audience as well as we could have at that point. So I think keep it simple, and yes, it's going to be bar graphs, line graphs for the most part, but those actually tell a really good story, and usually they get you what you're looking for.
Perfect. Well, it looks like we got time for one last question. So it seems like a little more in depth of a question from Nate. He says, influenced by Chicago-based narrative science, whose model of dashboards are primarily narrative-based, what's your attitude towards incorporating quantitative information into a quantitative dashboard?
Quantitative. Do you mind reading that one more time?
Yeah, no worries. He's just wondering, what's your attitude towards incorporating quantitative text/prose information into quantitative dashboard is what I'm reading. Oh, I might have meant qualitative dash. Yeah, I was thinking that.
Does it say text? Because I'm wondering if it's, so there's a lot of interesting possibilities, and I might have missed the connection to the Chicago-based part. So let me know if I can circle back to that part. But with language processing, there's a lot of potential capabilities and analysis that you can use with that. I think as far as dashboarding goes, there's a little bit less. If you're showing text, word cloud is one of the best ways to visually show distributions of how a word is used or the importance of different words. But I think more broadly than dashboards, the analysis of text has been a trend that's definitely becoming more and more important, more accessible. Just recently, I heard about an analysis of hundreds and I think it was thousands of different comments, and they were applying a sentiment to what emotion was dealing with the content or the comment. And so they could do an analysis of thousands and thousands and thousands of comments. What were the distributions of how the people were actually feeling, which is really interesting possibility. So I know that's not dashboarding and maybe not exactly the answer you were looking for, but that's what I think of when I think of that more of the qualitative side.
Yeah, totally. Perfect. Yeah, he also said that he meant qualitative. So,
okay.
Cool. Well, thanks very much for doing this, and we all appreciate that. I think this went really well. And thanks everyone for coming. Again, keep in the loop with all of these things that we're hosting on our website and all of our social media platforms. And the website is promotable.io. And again, we'll see you soon in the future. Thanks again.
All right. Thank you, Eric. And thank you, everyone.